Hello, I'm Alan Furstenberg,
And I'm Mark Tucker, and we are Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. How's it going, Mark?
It's going good. How about you, Alan?
Going well enough, ups, downs. It was what's the way to put this? I had a really exciting project in mind that I've been working on. And I tried working on it this weekend and just ran into all sorts of weird problems and turned to Stack Overflow to kind of get my mind off the problems, which wasn't wise because there were a bunch of people that had their own weird problems. Most of those I could at least help with, though. So that
Right.
was nice. But it kind of made me realize that, a couple of weeks back, we talked about best practices and how we approach things like, how do we approach the code that we do and how do we approach testing. We haven't really talked about how do we approach debugging because, I don't know about you, my code doesn't always work on the first try.
That is shocking.
I know.
Mine always never does on the first time.
So I figured it kind of make, and I'm kind of guessing for most people, doesn't always work exactly as you expect it to on the first time either. So I figured it might make sense to kind of chat about, on the rare occasions that things don't work quite right. How do we tackle these problems? And to be clear to everyone, not so rare. I just don't want programmers out there thinking that, anyway, on the occasions when we do have problems, what are the tips and tricks that we have to figuring out what's going on and getting ourselves back on track? Because I feel like that's a huge part of what programmers really do.
Yeah, no, it is. There's definitely a lot of trying to figure out what's wrong, what's not, quite working right, or why is it outright failing? Or those cases that it's always lovely when it's worked before and then the next day it doesn't work and you're like,
goodness, yes.
What did I change? And so
I think it's not always, let's be clear, it's not always that you changed anything.
That's true.
Sometimes it's, Amazon's or Google's language model has changed and suddenly the things that you were doing no longer work. Or the speech to text has suddenly changed and now everything just sounds weird. And how do you test that? How do we know?
Yeah, so what I'm thinking is maybe the first thing is that you need to have a good understanding of the whole system, because you need to try to figure out, is this a device problem? Is this a problem where it's hitting the Alexa service or the Google Action service in the cloud before it gets to your custom application? Is it something in the voice application itself?
And also I think as part of that, is this something that is happening because you're doing it on the test framework, or does this really happen on real devices? Does it happen on some real devices and not other real devices? Did the emulator not really emulate this correctly? A lot of questions that are really tough to figure out sometimes. So that's narrowing that down. That's an important first step.
Yeah, and it could be also, you need to think about timeout issues, or if you're making a call to an API, if something could have changed in the API. So just having a good overview of how everything works, just even from a basic standpoint, just to say, oh, I'm going to test over here, or if I'm going to test over here.
Yeah.
Because you have to kind of scope in on where you're going to focus your attention first.
Well, and I think actually scoping in is a good way to put it, because, almost inevitably the next thing you're going to do is start littering your code with console logs, right?
Yeah, that's definitely one way to do it. Yeah.
It's interesting because I can't actually think the last time I actually used a real debugger. Attached a debugger to my code and traced through things line by line as it was running. I rely a lot more on logs than I used to.
Oh, that's interesting. Is it because you're hitting issues that's in production as opposed to a local environment, or?
That's an interesting question. I think more of it is, I'm not sure it's because I'm hitting issues in production or that my mentality is now I may need to debug things in production, and how I debug things now, I know have the same mindset, even when it's
Oh,
not in production.
well, that's interesting because you do spend X number of hours added up over your lifetime as a software developer, right? Uh, that that could help if that's where you're most comfortable working. Then when you're thrown into that situation, if that's what you've always done, like going through the console logs or plugging in something like Sentry IO, so
Yeah.
when something happens in production that you don't even know about, that you get a stack frame, and you know what's at least kind of where the problem is
Hmm.
to zoom in on. So there is something to be said for that.
How do you normally debug? So do you use a debugger? Do you have a debugger hooked up to your
Yeah,
code,
so
or?
a lot of times for local development, I use something
Hmm.
like ngrok, or Jovo has their own built-in proxy that
Hmm.
points your webhook down to your local box, so I can use Visual Studio Code. They've made it really easy, even easier. Before you had to like attach the debugger, and now there's just a toggle that every
Hmm.
time you run your code, it will auto turn on the debugger, and you just have breakpoints in there, and off, and there you go. So
Yeah.
it's very helpful. But yeah, I do like the idea of like I said before with Sentry. So then that's something that is watching for things when you're
Hmm.
asleep, and can give you information. But those are the two things I typically do. So I probably do a little less debugging through console logs, but sometimes that's the only way that you have to do it,
No, that
because
makes
it's like
sense.
it's based on what environment. And I work on different environments, so like local environment, and then I can push things to an integration dev, staging, which is very similar to production, and then production, so that um, we can have different people testing in different
Hmm.
environments. But yeah, some of those other environments, then you really are having to do console logs, or you have to try to then duplicate the issue on your local dev and see if it's the
Right.
same or not, right? Which it may or may not be.
I think the other thing is, even if you're not using console logs, the number of times you get errors, that kind of, you need to read them and to start looking in the right direction. One of
Yeah,
the really frustrating things sometimes is when you get that stack trace that comes up and says, foo is undefined, or
yeah,
foo is not a member of undefined, and you're like, well, what's undefined here? Why isn't it defined?
yeah,
I think what's surprising though is that's where your that's where our history as programmers need to come in. This isn't necessarily a voice problem, it's a programming problem, but you still need to actually, read and understand the error.
yeah.
And that's not always easy to do. It's not always the first thing that comes to your mind.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I first started doing JavaScript more on the server, I was, I've done years of C sharp, but there was something, even every time I started a new language, I guess there's a little bit of apprehension with starting through the stack trace, because it's just like, I don't
I don't know
know.
what this means.
Yeah, I'm just like, that's, yeah. And so it's off to your search engine to search things up and stuff. For so, you know, if you're not used to that, then, just bite the bullet and go ahead and jump in. It's you'll get it.
Yeah.
It happens. You'll learn it.
I think one of the things that is more related to voice that I keep running into is the fact that even sometimes when there are errors on the server side, they're not bad enough to actually kill the response completely. So, and this was part of the problem I had this weekend, was it was just giving me the wrong response,
Yeah.
and I couldn't figure out why. And it was a long time until I finally bothered to look at the log and saw the error there. I'm like, oh, I'm getting nonsense back because there's an error. So this didn't complete correctly. And I didn't know it because I was still getting enough of a response back.
Yeah, so that would be I guess the next point that I would like to highlight is that get to know the JSON request and response formats.
Definitely.
Just, you don't have to memorize everything, but you need to be able to, plow through there, find individual values like, oh, this is the value that uniquely identifies the user, so that I can use that and go find it in the database if I need to. What is the information, like doing quite a bit with interactive canvas. So you get back a simple response, which is what your typical text-to-speech response would be, but you could also get a rich response, which includes what the URL is for your interactive canvas, plus any data that you're passing it. And I spend quite a bit of time looking in there and saying, oh, here's my mark tag. Yes, that is where I think it's supposed to be. Here is the data that's coming back. Oh, I'm missing something in that data, or something's not quite getting
Yep.
passed. So
Yeah, no, looking at that data, for me,
Yep.
a lot of my debugging ended up being looking at what was being stored in the session state that was
Yep.
being passed back and forth, and looking at it and saying, well, why am I missing this value here? Why, it looks like I'm passing this in. Oh, wait, I'm not passing this in. Maybe that's the problem.
Yeah.
So tracing it down like that is certainly a big part of trying to understand what's going on. And I think with Actions on Google, now that we've got this notion that we have scenes and slot filling with scenes and intents, and you've got a lot of different things, and it's not always obvious how everything fits together. So
Correct.
using the debugging that's included as part of the test tool, where you can open it up and say, okay, here's what matched. Here's what I did because this matched. Here's what didn't match. Here's the session state at the time. Here's the user state at the time. Here's the webhook that I called with these values. Here's what I got back. Here's what I did. The fact that it can spell all of that out for you is incredibly useful, but it's a lot of information. And if you're not used to thinking about it that way, that can get overwhelming. So, you're right. It is very much, you need to learn the request and response formats. And you kind of need to learn the rest of what is the rest of that that's being formatted here. What other information is it giving me as I'm testing it?
Yeah, because you could catch something very easily just by looking at the request. You're like, oh, it didn't find the right intent. And then you're like, oh, okay, that's, or any intent.
Right. Right. It triggered a no match instead of the intent that I was looking for. Why didn't it find that intent? Oh, because I forgot to put any training phrases in that intent.
Yeah. So you could spend an hour looking at your code trying to figure out what's wrong, but you're not going to find it because it's not,
it's not there
in the language model.
Right. Why didn't it reply back with this? Oh, because I forgot to include that reply. There are lots of things beside the code itself that fit into this that you need to look at.
Well, yeah, and that reminds me. So, like on Dialogflow, you can just type in a specific utterance, and it will tell you which intent it matches to, and even execute it, which doesn't necessarily always help because there's always state and stuff behind what.
Sure, but one of the things about it though is you can try out a bunch of different phrases and see and make sure that they match correctly.
Right.
And if not, well, okay, now you can add training phrases or see that one of your training phrases has triggered the wrong intent.
Yeah.
And now you get to go figure out, well, why did it trigger the wrong intent? And how do I fix that?
Yeah. Yeah, there's on the Alexa side of things, in the Alexa developer console, there's also a tool where without actually running your code, it just checks the language model. You can type in an utterance and it will tell you kind of what order it matched this first, it matched that second, type of thing. So then that would help, give you something where you could quickly iterate and fix your language model without having to jump into code and running your code, which takes longer.
Mm-hmm. All of these are kind of interesting tips and tricks. And, I'm sure that as soon as we're done recording this,
oh yes,
both of us are going to say, we should have mentioned this, or we're going to get somebody writing in saying, here's what I always run into that fixes it. I think one of the important things is that it's okay to run into problems. And when you do, it's okay to turn to others to help you debug it.
Right.
Stack Overflow is fantastic for that. The forums are good places for that. The big thing though is make sure you include as much information as you can.
Right.
So, including an error message is great. Including the error message without showing the code doesn't always help as much.
And sometimes you need to give the run up of this is what happened, try to isolate and repeat it. Sometimes there are bugs that I hit that then I run it and I don't hit again and I never see it again. I know it's one
Kaizen
of those
bugs are
things.
scary.
Those are really scary. So, but you need to try to identify and reproduce it and try to get it to isolated as small as possible. So you can then just start playing around. Well, what if I change this here? Then you really start, getting to the point where then you can start asking questions, or this is what I'm doing and this is the error that I'm getting. So those are the types of things where somebody can look at your code quickly, look at the scenario like, oh, I've hit that before, or it's probably this, as opposed to I've got this problem, no context or too little context.
Right.
And you were like, I would like to help, but I can't. I just,
in every case, the more information that people can provide, the better our chances are of helping, helping them figure out the problem. The other question I want to see is people will say things like, here's what my sample conversation looks like, and it's giving me the wrong response here. Okay. Can I see the intents that you think should be matching? Do you have any information about what is or isn't matching? What is your code doing when it thinks it's matching? There's a lot more than just, I got the wrong answer.
right.
I need everything. And you as a programmer should be thinking about everything too. It's not that I need this information because it's, the only clue. It's, this is my thought process. This is how I tackle a problem. And that's to start breaking down where it could be.
So I guess just one thing to note on this, especially if you're working for a client or a business, make sure when you post code samples or information,
they're sanitized.
That you don't leak anything. It's happened. There was actually something I had posted just this last year, and I had to quickly delete it because I looked over it and I thought for sure I looked at every place that there was text or something, and I'm like, oh, I'm good, and I posted it, and then almost immediately I saw, oh no, and it was I had leaked a little bit of information. So and you might have to write a small sample project that's sanitized and just does the thing that you're having problems with to reproduce it. So then, maybe you could zip that small portion up and send it someplace.
And one of the things, I think my final point on this is one of the things that's really good about creating either a minimal example or just writing up everything is that at least half the time when I've started doing that, it will suddenly occur to me, oh, that's the problem. And I don't have to actually post it.
You know what else works for me? Is I'm like, I just need a second set of eyes. Let me just walk you through the problem I'm having. And as I'm explaining the situation, sometimes it just clicks like, oh, maybe it's this or something, or if that doesn't work, then the person sometimes has an idea of different things to try, just a fresh set of eyes.
Have you ever heard of the phrase rubber duck debugging?
I have heard of that.
That's what it is. It's, you have to explain it. So you have to explain it to somebody. Why not explain it to the rubber duck?
And he just might be able to help you figure it out.
Ernie's laws of programming.
That's funny. I like that. One other thing I want to point out on debugging is just the timeout issue. You want to make sure that the request and the response comes back in a certain amount of time. It's around 5 seconds, I think, for Google, 7 seconds for Alexa. If it takes that, too much time, like if you've got a breakpoint, you're obviously going to break that time. But you could still walk through your code to a point where you could probably figure it out. But if the problem is that it's not coming back with the response, then maybe it's a timeout in your code. And if you're using something like Lambda, then it's going to show you for every request response to the Lambda, how much time it took. But I actually learned that there's an additional value that gets passed when it's a cold boot time. So the whole time, what's going to typically be recorded is how much time it takes for the code to run. But there's this other value, if it happens to be a cold Lambda start, that's going to take some more time. It's not calculated in the amount that you're billed, but it is still calculated in the overall time of how long it takes. So you might be hitting a situation where you're fine typically when the Lambda is running and warm, but the first time it takes some time, especially if you've got lots of libraries that you're pulling in and things like that, then that might be the problem to check.
Related problem that I see a lot of is, when I am developing something and testing it, seems to run, reasonably quickly on my machine. And then I go and deploy it and it takes an inordinate amount of time on the Lambda or the Cloud function. And it's because that it needs more CPU in those cases. So,
right.
Don't
256 may not be enough. Don't be stingy.
Don't assume that if you can get it in just under the 5-second mark on your machine, that it'll be okay on the network, because it won't.
Right.
So
well, and especially if you've got additional latency, like if you're running it out of US East, but you're using the same Lambda for the UK, then you're adding additional latency to it.
Right. And you've got an API and, you don't know where that API is running. And it may be closer to you at home than it is at Amazon, or,
Yeah.
It's don't, we say 5 minutes, 5 seconds, 5 minutes. We say 5 seconds. Don't try to push that number. You want to make it as fast as you can.
5 seconds is an eternity to a user. 2 seconds is,
it really is.
Seems like a lot longer than 2 seconds for a visual, because at least you got some sort of a cursor or like progress bar or something on the UI that you can fake it to make it look like, oh yeah, it's doing something. But with voice, if there's just this quiet for 2 seconds,
it's eternity.
Yes, it is a long time. Oh, I've got a question. Have you ever hit the situation where your response payload size is too large that it just dies?
No, I have not heard that one.
Maybe it's just an Alexa thing, but with APL, like if I'm doing lots of lists and things, or a big APL payload, there's things that you can do to mitigate that issue. And I can't remember what the number is. For some reason, 52,000 or 52K pops into my head, but I'm not exactly sure if that's the right number. But
and I take it back, because I do now remember a situation where I have seen a Stack Overflow question that amounted to, that showed it. And again, this was a case where fortunately the person provided a lot of information. And my observation was that JSON looks truncated that you're reporting. You haven't shown me everything, but I think whatever you're showing me is getting truncated and is too big. And I don't remember what we eventually figured out the size was, but it did turn out they were just sending back a payload that was larger than they could.
Yep.
And again, this is another example of why it's important to understand what the request and response looks like, at least get a feel for what may look odd.
Yeah, because as you're getting into it, then you kind of get used to what it typically looks like. If you start scrolling through something that's really big and then just kind of ends, you're like, oh, this isn't looking like a typical response.
Or, there are fields that I expect here that are missing. Why?
Yep.
So that's the kind of feel that you need to get when you're doing debugging. So if you've got debugging tips or debugging stories or nightmares,
yes,
we'd love to hear them. Feel free to comment below or find us on Twitter, and maybe we'll talk about them another time on Two Voice Devs.
That sounds good. Take care, everybody. Two Voice Devs.
Take care.